So in this video, we're going to introduce you to another way to solve quadratic equations called the quadratic formula. And so let's do a little recap. So as you remember, our standard form quadratic is given by ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And in our last videos, we have been looking at ways to solve this quadratic equation. So let's recap which ways we've seen so far. Okay, so the first way that we've seen for solving quadratic equations is solve by factoring. And here's an example. Solve x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. We put our quadratic equation in standard form, and then we factor completely. Then we set each of the factors to 0 and solve for x. Okay. Now, the pros about using this method is that if the quadratic equation factors easily, then you can do this method pretty fast. The cons are that if the quadratic equation doesn't factor, or if it's difficult to factor the quadratic equation, if it's just not an easy process for you, then this might not be a good method. Okay? All right, so then we were introduced to the square root property, solving by the square root property. So here's an example. X squared equals 128. And this was the method in which we took the square root of both sides, and then we remembered our plus or minus, right? And then we would look inside the radicand and pull out perfect squares, and that would give us our exact answers. Okay, so this is not a difficult method. It's actually a pretty good method if you have, like in our example, no middle term, so b is 0. So your quadratic equation has no bx term. Or if we could set up the equations like as quantity squared equals number, right? And so we did a few of those in past videos. So the con is that it doesn't work for all equations the way that it's stated, right? But then we went ahead and looked at a third method called completing the square. And in completing the square, this was a method that worked for all quadratic equations, but it could be a bit tedious, right? Okay, so in this video, we are actually going to use our completing the square method, which can work for all quadratics, and we are going to derive the fourth method, which is called solve by using the quadratic formula. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the completing the square method on our standard quadratic equation in standard form, and instead of having numbers in, as ABC, we're just going to leave the ABCs there and do the process. Okay. All right. So the first step, if you recall, when we are completing the square, is that we have to divide by a, because we need to get that leading coefficient. Divide by a, because we need to get the leading coefficient in front of the x squared to be a 1. So our very first step will be that we're going to take every term and we're going to divide it by a. Okay? And then 0 divided by a is 0. So we did both sides. Okay? Then the second step is that we're going to move the constant. We're going to move the constant. So we're going to subtract the constant, and in our quadratic here, the constant's the one that has no x, so it's this one. Okay, so here, these two a's are going to give me 1, because I needed that 1x squared, and that's why we divide it, right? And then here we have b over a times x, and now I'm going to leave some room here, because this is where I'm going to complete the square, and then over here I'm going to subtract the c over a, and again, leave room for where I'm going to complete the square, which is step number 3. So step number 3 is complete the square. And if you recall, how we do that is we look at that middle coefficient. So this middle coefficient, which is now b over a, and we take half of that. So 1/2 of b over a, and half of a fraction means multiply the fraction by a half. So I'm going to multiply across b over 2a. That's half of the middle coefficient. And then we square that. So this is going to get squared. So now we're going to get b squared over 4a squared. And that gets added here. B squared over 4a squared and here. So both sides to keep the equation balanced, right? Okay, step number 4 now is that we're going to factor the perfect square trinomial that's on the left. Factor the trinomial. Okay, so that's going to be x plus, and then here you're going to put whatever you squared to get this guy, right? So that's b over 2a. All right, just reminding you, that's what we squared. B, see it over here on the right-hand side, okay? And then the 5th step is we have to add these two fractions on the right, okay? So we're going to add the fractions, add fractions on the right, which means we need an LCD, a least common denominator, which is 4a squared. So this guy we're going to multiply by 4a so that we can get a 4a squared here, and anything we do to the denominator of a fraction we must do to the numerator so that things are balanced. So now in this next step, notice these two have the same denominator, so I'm going to make one big fraction. I'm going to go ahead and change the order here and put the b squared first so that this subtraction, this negative, goes in second. And then here, when I multiply these, I'm just going to put the coefficient in front and put these in alphabetical order. So 4ac. All right, beautiful. So now, notice that we have quantity squared equals number. Quantity squared equals number. Yes, I know it doesn't look like it, but this whole fraction here on the right-hand side, that's a number. So now we are going to use the square root property. So step number 6, take the square root of both sides. Okay. Square root property. So square root of something squared is x plus b over 2a. But over here on the right hand side, we're going to remember our plus or minus, and then we've got the square root of a fraction. But you know that we can split up this big square root here and make it into two individual square roots. The square root of the numerator divided by the square root of the denominator, which is 4a squared. And by the way, do you notice the perfect square here in the denominator? So let's simplify that. So we have x plus b over 2a equals plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Just a note, just a reminder that we cannot simplify this b squared that's here in the numerator because these are terms, and there's a subtraction. These are terms. They are not factors. So we can't do a piece of a binomial. We can't simplify a square root for just a piece, right? So we're going to leave that alone. Okay, step 7 is solve for x. Solve for x. So that means we're going to subtract this b over 2a. This guy needs to be subtracted, just moved over. So x equals the opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over. Do you notice that both of the fractions have the same denominator? So I'm going to make it a one big fraction all over 2a. And then this is called the quadratic formula, which you should memorize. Okay, go to the next video so that you can see examples of how to use the quadratic formula. And reminder, it came from completing the square. Cool. So it works for all quadratics. Works for all quadratic equations.